The sun was too bright for a day like this. It felt all wrong to the man standing stiffly in his driveway. He was dressed in his Marine Corps uniform, the dark blue wool heavy and familiar on his shoulders. The medals were pinned perfectly over his heart, but they felt cold. He kept his eyes on the front door of his house, the house they had shared. Inside, friends and family moved quietly, speaking in low voices. The scent of coffee and flowers filled the air. His wife's sister was holding their young daughter, who was too small to understand why everyone was so sad. His own mother patted his arm as she passed by, her eyes red. He just nodded, unable to find any words. He had been trained to be strong, to be a rock. Today, that training was the only thing holding him together. His mind kept drifting back to her laugh, which was loud and free and could change the mood of an entire room, to the way she would squeeze his hand during the scary parts of a movie, even though he'd seen far scarier things in real life, to the quiet strength she showed through every single doctor's appointment, every bad news, every long night. She was the bravest person he had ever known, and now she was gone. The funeral director, a man with a kind and gentle face, approached him. "We're ready whenever you are," he said softly. The man just gave another sharp nod. This was it, the final thing he could do for her. The pallbearers, his brothers from the service and her brothers from childhood, carefully brought the casket out of the house. They moved with a slow, respectful grace. Seeing the polished wood in the sunlight made his throat tighten. This was real. This was happening. The hearse, long and black and gleaming, was parked right in front of their home. The driver stood quietly by the open back door. The small procession of cars for the family was lined up behind it, engines off. Their quiet street, usually just a place with kids riding bikes and people walking dogs, had become a road to the cemetery dot as the men slid the casket into the hearse. A silence fell over the small crowd gathered on the lawn. It was a deep, aching quiet. The birds chirping in the trees suddenly sounded too loud, too cheerful. This was the moment. The last moment she would be at their home. He felt his feet carry him forward, off the curb and onto the warm asphalt of the street. He stopped a few feet behind the hearse. He was alone in the quiet road. Everyone watched him. His daughter, his mother, his friends. The men who had carried the casket stood at attention nearby. He took a deep, shaky breath that burned in his chest. He thought of her smile. He thought of the promise he had made to always take care of her. He thought of the last time he held her hand. His right hand, which had been hanging stiffly at his side, slowly came up. His fingers straightened and came together perfectly, as they had 1,000 times before. He brought his hand up to his brow in a sharp, clean salute. It was a soldier's goodbye, a Marine's promise of eternal respect. It was the highest honor he knew how to give. Tears, which he had fought back all morning, finally broke free. They streamed down his face, tracing paths through his closely shaven cheeks. But his posture did not waver. His salute did not tremble. He held it, his eyes fixed on the back of the hearse, seeing not the car, but her face. The world around him, the soft crying from the lawn, the rustle of leaves, the distant sound of a lawnmower faded into a dull hum. There was only her, and this final act of love. He didn't know how long he stood there. It could have been 5 seconds or a minute. In his grief, time had lost all meaning. He was in a bubble of sorrow, honoring the woman who had been his anchor through war, through peace, through everything. He did not hear the car approach. He did not see the police cruiser slide to a stop a little way down the street, its lights off. He was completely unaware of the officer stepping out of the car, of the man looking at the scene with confusion. The officer saw a man standing in the middle of the road, blocking a hearse. He didn't see the uniform, the medals, the grieving family on the lawn. In that moment, the officer saw a problem in the street that needed to be solved. The bubble was about to be shattered. The police officer had been on a routine patrol when the call came over his radio. A neighbor, peeking through their blinds at the gathering, had called it in. Not as a funeral, but as a disturbance and someone blocking the street. The officer was new to this quiet suburb. Most of his days were filled with helping stranded motorists or taking reports about stolen packages. He was not prepared for what he was walking into. He pulled his cruiser up behind the line of cars, his mind already clicking into a simple checklist. Car in the road? Check. Man standing in the road? Check. Traffic is stopped? Check. His training pushed him to clear the obstruction first, ask questions later. The profound silence of the scene, the palpable sorrow hanging in the air, these were details as urgent. Task-oriented mind did not immediately process. He got out of his car and began walking up the street towards the man standing there. He saw the man's back, saw his arm raised. He didn't recognize the perfect, still form of a military salute. From his angle, it could have been anything, a man waving his arms, maybe even threatening someone. "Sir?" The officer called out, his voice cutting through the quiet like a slap. "You need to clear the roadway." The man at the hearse did not move. He was a million miles away, holding on to a memory with every fiber of his being. The sound of the officer's voice was just a distant noise, like traffic from a far-off highway. He was saying goodbye. The rest of the world had ceased to exist. On the lawn, people stirred. Heads turned towards the officer. A few people raised their hands, trying to wave him off, to signal that this was a funeral, to please be quiet. But the officer's focus was locked on the man in the street. The man was ignoring a direct order. That was a problem that needed to be fixed. "Sir, I am not going to ask you again." The officer's voice was louder now, sharper. It held a tone of rising frustration. He felt the eyes of the crowd on him. He felt his authority was being challenged, right here in the middle of the street. He needed to establish control. He took a few more steps closer. He did not try to walk around to see the man's face, to see the tears, to see the uniform. He did not try to gently touch his shoulder. The checklist in his head was moving forward. Verbal command given. Verbal command ignored. Next step, his hand went to the device on his belt. It was a taser, a tool he had been trained to use when someone was non-compliant and could be a danger. In his mind, a man standing frozen in the street, ignoring police orders, fit that description. The profound, tragic context was invisible to him. He raised the taser. "Clear the road now, or I will use force." A gasp went up from the woman holding the little girl on the lawn. The child, sensing the sudden fear in the adults around her, began to whimper. One of the pallbearers, a big man with a shaved head, took a step forward. "Officer, wait," he started, his voice low and urgent. But it was too late. The officer fired. There was a loud, horrifying pop-pee, followed by a crackling, electric sizzle that no one who heard it would ever forget. Two small dart-like probes shot out, trailing thin wires, and struck the grieving man squarely in the back. A jolt of electricity, 50,000 volts, ripped through the man's body. His perfect salute collapsed instantly. Every muscle in his body locked up, then convulsed violently. He did not cry out. The air was forced from his lungs in a harsh, choked grunt. He fell forward, his body hitting the warm asphalt with a sickening thud. His uniform was now dirtied with street dust. His body twitched and jerked under the relentless current. For a second, there was absolute, stunned silence. The sound of the taser's crackle seemed to echo. The sight was so shockingly wrong, so violently out of place, that people's minds couldn't fully grasp it. Then, the world erupted. The man's mother screamed, a raw sound of pure agony. His little daughter began to wail, reaching for her fallen father. The sister-in-law turned the child's face away, sobbing herself. The funeral director stood frozen in horror, his hands over his mouth, but the loudest sound was not a scream. It was a roar that came from the 6 men who had carried the casket. They were all former Marines. A second before, they had been mourners, brothers in grief. Now, in the blink of an eye, they were soldiers again. One of their own was down, attacked from behind. The training, the instinct, the unbreakable bond, it all switched on at once. Their grief transformed. It didn't disappear. It hardened. It became a cold, focused fury. Their eyes, wet with tears a moment ago, were now dry and blazing. They were no longer just friends at a funeral. They were a unit, and they had just watched their brother fall. Asterisk. The roar wasn't a word. It was a sound of pure, gut-level reaction. It came from deep in the chest of the biggest pallbearer, a man with a build like a linebacker. That sound broke the stunned silence and set everything into motion. The 6 men did not run. They did not panic. They moved with a terrifying, coordinated speed that spoke of years of training together. While the crowd on the lawn was still frozen in shock, these 6 were already acting. The first 2, including the one who had roared, were at their fallen brother's side in 3 long strides. They moved past the police officer, who was now standing with the empty taser in his hand, looking suddenly confused by what he had just done. The Marines ignored him completely. Their mission was the man on the ground dot as the taser's 5-second cycle ended. The grieving man's body went limp, his muscles turning to jelly. He was conscious, but dazed, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. A terrible confusion swam in his eyes, the deep sorrow of goodbye now mixed with the sharp, animal shock of pain and betrayal. The first Marine knelt, blocking his friend from the officer's view. He didn't shake him or yell. He put a firm, steadying hand on his shoulder and spoke close to his ear. "Look at me. Breathe. You're okay. We're here." His voice was low, calm, and absolute. It was the voice you use in a crisis. The second man positioned himself at their feet, his broad back forming a wall dot at the same time. The other 4 men fanned out. They didn't form a scared huddle. They formed a perimeter. It was instinctual. One took position near the front of the hearse, another near the back of the family cars. 2 more positioned themselves between the scene in the street and the horrified family on the lawn. Their posture changed. Their casual funeral stance was gone. Now they stood with their feet shoulder-width apart, hands ready at their sides, eyes scanning. They were not aggressive, but they were immovable. They were creating a zone of control. The police officer took a step forward, his mouth opening to say something. He never got the chance. The Marine kneeling by his friend looked up. He locked eyes with the officer. There was no yelling, no dramatic shouting. The Marine's face was like stone, but his eyes burned with a cold fire. "Do not take another step," the Marine said. His voice was quiet, but it carried a tone of absolute authority that made the young officer stop dead. "You are done here. Back up, now." The officer flinched. He was used to being the one in charge, the one people listened to. This was different. This was a force of nature staring him down. He took a single stumbling step backward. On the lawn, the scene was one of protective chaos. The sister-in-law, crying openly, was shepherding the little girl and the older mother quickly toward the house. "Inside, go inside now," she urged, her voice trembling. The other mourners, friends and family, were being gently but firmly directed by the 2 Marines near them. "Please, everyone, go back into the house. For your safety. Go now." People moved, too shocked to argue, their cries muffled by the sudden military precision taking over their quiet street. one of the Marines by the cars. A man with a sharp gaze turned and called out to the funeral director, who was still standing by his hearse, pale as a ghost. "Sir, can you please pull the vehicle to the curb and secure it? We need the street clear." The director just nodded, moving on autopilot, climbing into the hearse to move it in under a minute. The entire feeling of the street had changed. What was a peaceful, sad funeral procession had become a secure incident site. The 6 men, without a single weapon, had secured the area. Their fallen brother was in the center, being shielded. Civilians were being moved to safety. A potential threat, the confused officer, was being contained outside their perimeter. The officer, now standing 10 feet back by his open car door, finally found his voice. He reached for his radio, his hand shaking. His voice cracked as he spoke into it. "Unit 714, I need backup, immediately. At the corner of Maple and Pine, I have a situation." He looked from the stone-faced man guarding his friend to the others, standing like statues at their posts. They weren't looking at him with anger anymore. They were looking at him like he was a piece of the landscape, a problem that had been neutralized and was now being managed. That was somehow worse. Their complete, silent control of the street was more intimidating than any shout could ever be in the middle of it all. The man on the ground coughed, trying to push himself up on an elbow. The Marine beside him kept a firm hand on his back. "Easy. Don't try to get up yet. Just breathe. Look at me. You're safe." The fallen man's eyes, wet and lost, focused on his friend's face. The shock was beginning to fade, and what was left was a devastation deeper than any of them had ever seen. It wasn't just from the electricity. It was from the horrible, wrenching violation of the moment meant for his final goodbye. That sacred moment was now lying broken on the asphalt, surrounded by his brothers, who had formed a fortress of flesh and bone to protect what little was left. The sound of sirens broke the strange, tense quiet that had fallen over the street. They started as a distant wail and grew quickly into a sharp, screaming arrival. Within 2 minutes, the scene was transformed again. 3 more police cruisers skidded to a stop at odd angles, their blue and red lights painting the quiet houses and the somber faces on the lawn in frantic, flashing colors. The noise was jarring, completely wrong for the day. Officers poured out of the cars, their hands hovering near their belts, eyes wide as they tried to understand what they were seeing. They expected a fight, a riot, a dangerous suspect. Instead, they saw a surreal and solemn picture. A man in a dirty dress uniform was sitting on the asphalt, being tended to by another man in a suit. 4 other men stood at calm, strategic points around them, watching the new arrivals without a word. A hearse was parked neatly at the curb, and in the middle of it all stood their fellow officer, pale and alone by his car, looking more like a guilty child than someone in control. The newly arrived officers moved forward, a loose, confused group. The one who seemed to be in charge, a sergeant with a gray mustache, stepped ahead of the others. His eyes darted from his shaken officer to the man on the ground to the stern-faced men guarding him. He held up a hand to his officers, signaling them to slow down. "Okay, everybody just settle down," the sergeant called out, his voice trying to sound firm but betraying his confusion. "Let's figure out what's going on here. Officer, report." Before the young officer could even open his mouth, one of the Marines moved. It was the one who had been kneeling with the fallen man. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and calm. He walked forward a few paces, placing himself squarely between the police and his friends. He stopped at a respectful distance, but his posture made it clear he was a barrier. He looked directly at the sergeant, not at the nervous crowd of officers. "Sergeant," he said, and his voice was clear, level, and carried over the idle of the police engines. "My name is not important. What is important is that a crime has been committed here today by your officer." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. He didn't yell. He stated it as a simple, undeniable fact. "That man," he continued, pointing a thumb back towards his friend without taking his eyes off the sergeant, "is a retired United States Marine. We were conducting a funeral procession for his wife, who passed away after a long illness. He was giving a final salute to her. Your officer arrived, gave inadequate commands, and from behind, without warning or attempt to physically intervene, deployed his taser on a grieving veteran during his wife's funeral." A murmur went through the newly arrived officers. Some of their hands drifted away from their belts. They looked at the hearse. They looked at the family members now peering out from the windows of the house, their faces streaked with tears. They looked at the veteran's mother, who was being held back in the doorway by another woman, her body shaking with sobs. The sergeant's face changed. The professional mask softened and hardened into something else, a mix of horror and grim understanding. He looked past the Marine to the man on the ground, who was now being helped to his feet by another brother. The veteran stood unsteadily, his uniform disheveled, two small dark marks visible on the back of his jacket where the taser probes had struck. The Marine saw the sergeant's understanding. He pressed his advantage, not with threats, but with absolute, unyielding demands. "This is what is going to happen now," he said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "1, your officers will stand down. You will secure him." He pointed at the young officer, and his taser is evidence. 2, you will call for a medical team. Your officers will not approach my friend. Our people will bring the medics to him. 3, you will call your chief, the police chief. He needs to come down here right now and see what was done in the name of his department." He took a small step forward, his gaze unwavering. "We are not moving. We are not dispersing. We are ensuring the safety and dignity of our brother until the highest authority in your chain of command arrives to take responsibility for this. Do you understand this situation, Sergeant?" The street was silent, except for the crackle of police radios. The sergeant stared at this calm, furious man who spoke with the authority of a general. He looked at the ring of other veterans, solid as oak trees. He looked at the grieving family. He looked at his own officer, who couldn't meet his eyes. The sergeant knew. He knew about the bond. He knew this wasn't a mob. It was a protective detail. And he knew, in his gut, that every word the Marine had said was true. He let out a long, slow breath. He turned to his cluster of officers. "Holster your equipment," he ordered, his voice tired. "Johnson, secure Officer Reynolds' sidearm and taser. Do it now. Call for an ambulance, non-emergency, and someone get the chief on the phone. Tell him to come to Maple and Pine immediately. It's a code-level situation." Then he turned back to the Marine and gave a single, sharp nod. It wasn't a nod of defeat, but of grim acknowledgement. A line had been drawn in the middle of a suburban street, not with weapons, but with honor and a demand for justice. And for now, the men in suits, the brothers in grief, were the ones in control. The standoff had officially begun, and the next move belonged to the highest power the police had. The wait was long and heavy. The flashing police lights had been turned off, leaving the street in its ordinary afternoon light, which now felt strange and exposed. The ambulance had come. True to their word, the Marines allowed the 2 paramedics through their perimeter, but they walked right beside them. One of the brothers explained the situation in low tones: the funeral, the taser, the shock. The medics checked the veteran's vital signs, examined the 2 small burns on his back, and spoke to him gently. They said what everyone already knew: the physical wounds were minor. The other wounds, the ones you couldn't see, were a different story. The veteran sat on the bumper of the hearse, a blanket now over his shoulders. He had stopped crying. His face was empty, a shell of the man who had stood there saluting just an hour before. He answered questions with nods or single words. His brothers took turns sitting with him, a hand on his shoulder, not talking, just being a solid presence beside him. The young officer who had fired the taser sat in the back of his sergeant's car, head in his hands. He was isolated, not just by the vehicle, but by the silent condemnation of his own colleagues, who now avoided looking at him. The evidence bag with his taser lay on the hood of the car, a silent accusation. Then, a black SUV pulled up, quiet and official. The police chief got out. He was an older man, with a tired face that had seen everything in his decades of service. He took in the scene with one slow, sweeping look. He saw the hearse. He saw the man in the uniform on the bumper. He saw the ring of stern-faced men. He saw his own officers standing around looking ashamed and unsure. He didn't head for his sergeant first. He walked directly towards the Marine who had spoken earlier, the one who seemed to be in charge. The Marine stood up to meet him. "Chief," the Marine said, his voice flat. "I've been briefed on my way over," the chief said, his voice low and gravelly. He didn't offer excuses. He didn't talk about procedure. He looked past the Marine at the veteran. "Is he okay?" "Physically, he'll recover," the Marine replied. "In every other way, sir, your officer destroyed a moment that can never be gotten back." A man was saying goodbye to his wife. The chief closed his eyes for a second, pained. He nodded slowly. "I understand." He then did something no one expected. He walked past the Marine, past the perimeter, and went straight to where the veteran sat. He crouched down so he wasn't standing over him. The veteran's eyes, distant and hollow, slowly focused on him. "Son," the chief said, and his voice cracked a little. "I am the police chief. There are no words that can fix what happened here today. What was done to you was wrong. It was a disgrace. On behalf of this entire department, I am so terribly, deeply sorry." The veteran just stared at him. The apology didn't seem to reach him. It was like he was hearing it from underwater. After a moment, he gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't forgiveness. It was just an acknowledgement that the words had been spoken. The chief stood up, his knees cracking. He turned to face the street, to his officers, to the family in the windows, to the Marines. He spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "The internal investigation begins right now. The officer involved is suspended, effective immediately. His use of force will be reviewed by an independent board. I will be reviewing the footage from his own body camera and every patrol car here today. That footage will be released to the family and to the public. There will be full transparency." He looked at the sergeant. "Ensure the family and these gentlemen have anything they need. This is now a scene of an official investigation, but they are not subjects. They are the wronged party. You will assist them." Then he walked back to the middle of the street, right where the taser had been fired. He looked at the 6 Marines. "You have my word, and the word of this department, that this will be dealt with justly. You have my personal number, if you feel it is not." He took a card from his pocket and offered it to the lead Marine, who took it with a slow nod. The standoff was over. The Marines had gotten what they demanded: accountability and an apology from the highest level. Their protective posture softened. The perimeter dissolved. They gathered around their brother, helping him to his feet. The funeral director, after getting a quiet nod from the chief, approached. "Sir," he said softly to the veteran. "Your wife. She's still waiting. We can proceed whenever you're ready." The veteran looked at the hearse. He looked at his brothers. He took a deep, shuddering breath that seemed to be the first real breath he'd taken since he fell. "Okay," he whispered. "Let's go." The procession reformed, but it was different now. The quiet sorrow was mixed with a raw, exhausted tension. The police cars, now just silent vehicles, lined the street as the hearse and the few family cars pulled away, driving slowly toward the cemetery. The chief stood watching them go, his face set in a grim line. Later, at the graveside, the veteran stood once more. His uniform was wrinkled and dirty. The afternoon sun was lower in the sky. His brothers stood in a line beside him, all of them in their funeral suits. The veteran's hand came up again. This time it trembled violently. The perfect sharp salute from the morning was gone, broken by pain and electricity. But he held it, his face contorting with the effort of holding his emotions in. His brothers, one by one, raised their own hands in salute alongside him. It was no longer a solitary goodbye. It was a company of brothers, honoring both the wife they had lost and a husband who had been wounded in his most vulnerable moment. He stayed like that until the last bit of the casket was lowered. When his hand finally fell, it felt like a weight dropping. The battle for his wife was over. The battle to make sense of this day, to live with the memory of a shattered farewell, was just beginning. But he was not alone. The men who had locked down a street for him stood at his side, silent and steady, ready for the long road ahead.